Redundancies, a tough, emotional subject for SMEs. We actually recorded this webinar back in September, and since then there's been a slight change to the law. Furlough and notice periods are no longer compatible, and although the furlough scheme is now running through until the end of September, you can't use the government scheme to subsidise your staff on notice by putting them on furlough. Apart from that, and we've removed all of the references to furlough during this webinar, but apart from that, the law remains the same. And predominantly, redundancies are about process, procedure, and fairness. Making sure that you select the right people to go into pools for redundancy if you're going to make them, making sure you consult for the right length of period, and making sure you select your final choices fairly. It's a difficult and emotional subject, and many SMEs get parts of the procedure wrong, which, once you get to tribunal, can be very costly. During the course of this webinar, we're going to cover many of the points that you'll need to consider. It lasts about an hour. I hope you enjoy it, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. The agenda is going to be about, obviously, redundancy programs. We're going to talk about planning and timetabling, pools and selection, the essential side, which is consultation, how you work notice, especially alongside furlough, and any support that you give your employees and any support that we can give you. You know how our Thursday sessions work. We have a chat box on the right-hand side. It is moderated. How we're going to work the session today is we expect the training to last up to an hour. We recognise that some of you may need to be doing other things after an hour. Any questions that get asked, if you want to stay on and ask questions, you're very welcome to, and we will stay on as long as that is practically possible. Anybody who wants to ask a question and it doesn't get answered in the session, or you're not still listening, we will send a question and answer sheet out afterwards, and you will get a copy of the recording. At the end of this presentation, you'll get a copy of the slides as well. So there's plenty that goes with this, and there will be some material that we will email to you afterwards to support your redundancy programs. But without further ado, let me move on and talk about redundancy, because it's in the news everywhere at the moment. These are some random headlines I chose from the BBC yesterday. Dyson cutting 900 jobs, 1 in 6 UK car industry jobs could be lost. Hopefully it's not going to be as bad as that. Emirates Airlines, for instance, looking to cut 9,000 jobs citing the pandemic. It is all over everywhere. So we recognise that approximately 1 in 3 firms at the moment are considering redundancies in the next few months. We presume that means at least until October, when the furlough scheme ends. So there's a lot of it about. And it is a technically complex and challenging process. And what we want to do today is to make sure that you avoid the very common pitfalls, that you understand that redundancy is not about doing things on the hoof. It is about planning, and is about having a fair and effective redundancy procedure. I've already said, with meaningful consultation. We're going to talk about settlement agreements, because in certain circumstances they could be very viable alternatives, and then talk about notice and CGRS, and also outplacement and supporting of your employees as they move away from you. Let's start with a definition. Section 1391 of the Employment Rights Act 1996. Sorry, I'm not going to read all of the slides out, but it's an important piece of legislation. It's been around for many years now, and redundancy is clearly where you need to reduce workers. There are certain things that are fairly self-explanatory, where a business unit or a business is ceasing or relocating, where business has fallen off, or you just need fewer people. Perhaps there's a lot of automation going on. But Cathy, perhaps you can talk about reorganisation, because I know that's a common pitfall.
Yes, people often call it a reorganisation, and actually employers need to be aware that it may not be actually a redundancy, and therefore they cannot call it a redundancy. The definition is that the work must have ceased or diminished, or is about to cease or diminish at that location. If you're simply just reorganising people, then that's just what you're doing. You can't call it redundancy. So you do have to be very, very careful on that particular point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So what employment tribunals in particular are keen for employers to avoid are redundancies that aren't fair. And there are decades of case law on this, going back even beyond the Employment Rights Act in 1996, which talk about the need for meaningful and proper consultation, that it is not a subjective process, that you've handled it objectively, not subjectively. And a very important point, and we're going to be bashing on about this, that you have considered alternative employments for your employees that you're making redundant. So those are the three things in particular that they're looking about. And employment tribunals, and you can go and read loads of case law around, employment tribunals particularly hate processes that are a sham, really, where you've just done some box ticking and done minimal consultation, or the manager has just chosen their best mates to stay on, or where you've decided at the beginning that those are the people you're going to get. Now, how do we get them? Where there's been any discrimination, or where you haven't considered alternatives. And each of these we're going to consider carefully, or each of these principles we're going to consider carefully moving through. Now, what I did, because I think of this in terms of an employer, I've been an employer for many years, is to say, in what order would I want to do these things? Because the order is really quite important. And as an example, my son, a good friend of his, is going through a redundancy process at the moment. And I can just tell instinctively, he's been talking me through it, that they got a lot of these things in the wrong order. And in fact, they've already scored the employees before they ever announced the redundancy situation existed. There are two separate lists there. It's a very busy slide. And on the left, highlight, because that's collective redundancies for 20 or more employees, and we're going to talk about that later. There's a thing called an HR1, which tells the government that you're actually going to be making redundancies, large number of redundancies, and electing and finding representatives. And again, we'll talk about that later, that you don't have to do if you're making a smaller number of people redundant, 19 or less. But it is about announcing the redundancy situation first before you define the groups of those employees who are going to be affected, and then talk to those actual employees themselves. At that point, when those people know they've been affected, you explain to them what the selection criteria are before you then go away and score and inform them, because importantly, they are allowed to challenge and consult with you about those criteria. There are a couple of things that are marked ×2 here, considering alternative employments, and we're going to talk about those later. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about those now, but there is then individual consultation before the dismissal and the dismissal meeting. And then we're going to talk about the concept of appeals, because appeals are not something that you necessarily have to do in law, but a number of people recommend it as absolutely best practice. And if you don't do it, people don't like it. So let me move on to the big questions, because I'm going to ask Peter in a moment, but these are the big questions that employers should be asking themselves. While we're doing redundancy, have we got any alternatives to it? Is this a genuine redundancy? And how many people are affected? Really important questions, because they set your timetable and your planning. but also, is there a redundancy policy? And Peter, perhaps you could just talk me through redundancy policies and what we mean by these three sort of different flavors of redundancy policies.
The three different flavors are having a policy probably in a handbook, but not necessarily, which may or may not be contractual. It may just form part of the terms and conditions, or it may just be what the HR department look up when redundancies come along. Collective agreement is much more specific. It is an agreement with usually a trade union about how redundancies will be done. And then there is custom and practice, which is a much more nebulous concept. But if as an organization you always follow pretty much the same procedure, and it's not just about procedure, because some procedures will also, policies will talk about how much redundancy pay or pay in lieu of notice or however it's done. And custom and practice tends to be more controversial, where employers are saying, well, times are tough, we can't be as generous as we used to be in relation to redundancy pay and settlement, not settlement payments, but any other sort of severance payments or arrangements.
Okay.
We recommend you have a policy.
Yes.
Nearly all of our clients do.
Okay. So we fall back on statutory policies where there isn't a policy, although statutory may at times be more generous or less generous depending on how things like notice are worked out.
Yeah.
Okay. So that is asking yourself, is there a redundancy policy which we need to follow other than just the statutory guidelines? And also, of course, and we talk about, sorry, this is slide 11. The numbering down the bottom right-hand corner hasn't quite worked out there, but it will do on other slides because I've checked them. But the alternatives to compulsory redundancy, there are a number of obvious ones if you're sitting down, because a redundancy is an extremely expensive process to go through. So if there is an alternative, especially if you think this may be a short-time fall-off in business, and you have a number of very valued employees, there are different things that you can look at. Recruitment freezes, short-time working, and layoffs and furlough, we're all very familiar with because furlough has been around. But Cathy, perhaps you could talk, because I know we've done this with organisations in the past. First of all, about pay freezes, which may be marginal, but pay cuts in particular.
Yes, I mean, if the reality is that the employer needs to make a serious amount of money, then the decision in terms of savings is either headcount, which is obviously often the largest overhead within an organisation. But a lot of employers miss a trick, and they don't actually consider whether the entire workforce would be willing to take a pay cut, or 5%, 10%, up to 20%. And let's face it, a lot of employees have been on a 20% pay cut if they've been furloughed. So the reality is you might actually get a greater saving by talking with your employees and getting them to all sign up to a pay cut. Now, it does have to be right across the board. So clearly you've got to get agreement from the top, because directors, partners, etc. have also got to accept that they're going to take the same amount of pay cut as well. But you may well get significant cost savings, but still have your workforce. So therefore you're better equipped to continue with the challenges that we're currently all facing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And we will also talk about settlement agreements later, because certainly where redundancy programs are very small, settlement agreements may be a quicker, cleaner, and simpler and potentially safer way of dealing with the same problem. So the very, very important thing, we talked about the order that redundancy typically happens in, but the extremely important thing right at the start of this process is about planning. And the first big question, and again, we'll talk about actually how those numbers are calculated later, but looking about the number of people who are affected by a redundancy program to calculate how long the consultation period has to be as an absolute minimum, who has to carry out that consultation, who is going to be doing it, and then setting out a timetable for the organisation. The key meeting dates, and make no mistake, even if you're making 6 or 7 or 8 people redundant, you may need to meet them many times in terms of meetings, write them lots of letters, and it is surprising how quickly the consultation time can get used up. And one of the key things to do is, of course, when you're setting out your timetable, check out the availability of key personnel. If they're away on maternity leave or if they're away on holiday or whatever, I doubt whether they'll be going, many of them will be going abroad at the moment, but if they're going away, check who you've got around and when they're around, so that you can fit the timetable around that, and it can be done with relatively ease. And then sit down and do a costing exercise of redundancy compared to the other alternatives. I am going to go. This is a quote that I use quite a lot. It's a quote that was done by an expert in this field, and she's actually on the line with us at the moment. And I'm going to ask her what "there is nearly always a pool" means, Cathy.
Okay, so we've established that you must have a fair selection criteria, because otherwise you could end up in an employment tribunal for unfair dismissal on the grounds of a poor or unfair selection for redundancy. Now, there's plenty of case law about redundancy pools, and the real pitfall that people make is that they think, oh, there's only one person with that job title, so therefore they must be a pool of one. Wrong. They have to actually have a completely unique job role. So the first thing you've got to ask yourself is, with that job, are there similar roles within the business, or equivalent roles, or indeed potentially roles at a similar level? Because if there are, it may well be that there's a much bigger pool than one person, and the affected employee will be quick to point out to you that you should have considered them in a bigger pool than you have. So whilst you may occasionally get pools of one, the reality is often you've got bigger pools, and therefore you then got to move on, as the rest of this slide identifies, into a proper objective selection criteria.
Yeah. So, and again, the next slide talks much more about objective selection criteria, but this is about the point of how you identify those people who may be at risk of redundancy, and then select the individuals who are actually going to be made redundant from that, if that is indeed the course you're going to go down.
The first thing it's really important to say is it's not a question of, here's a list of people that we want to get rid of, now how do we do the selection criteria? It's about agreeing what is the key skills that you need for the organisation, defining what those skills are, and then deciding, if there's one particular quality or skill that is absolutely paramount, then you might wish to give that more weighting as a consequence. So this is all done as part of your planning process.
Yeah. Okay. But the important thing about selection criteria, as we shall see, is that they're either qualitative or quantitative, that they can be weighted, that they're clearly defined. In other words, somebody coming in objectively looking at it can understand why somebody has been scored like that. So when we're talking about selection criteria, we've got what we consider to be some good examples down the left, some bad examples down the right, and there is one here, Peter, I know that causes considerable debate. Sometimes it could be either included on the left or the right, which is things like attendance and disciplinary records. because they're things that people love to use, but there's a big note of caution on them, isn't there?
Yeah, the easy one to address is disciplinary records. Problem is, people use very old disciplinary records that are warnings that are expired, or they say, well, I gave him a serious talking to about 3 months ago. Probably isn't in writing and might actually have been 6 months ago, and as far as we're concerned, doesn't count. Attendance is difficult for 2 reasons. Often people do not have good attendance records, and therefore it's not very objective. And secondly, often people's attendance records are influenced by disabilities, and choosing people for redundancy on the grounds of their disability is going to be automatically unfair and dangerous and very expensive. So be very careful with attendance.
And when you say they often don't have good attendance records, we're not talking about employees here. We're actually talking about the employer and
sorry,
how
yes,
they maintain their attendance record.
Indeed. Yeah. If you've not got good attendance records, don't do it.
No. Okay. So you can see that the good examples down the left are very measurable. We're talking about measurable performance, targets and KPIs. These are things that are objective. They're written down. They're very difficult to challenge. If you haven't hit your target for the last 7 months and you're in sales, then you haven't hit your target for the last 7 months. The bad examples, there's one here that Cathy, I think, is often used as a tiebreaker, last in, first out, or LIFO, or LIFO, or however you pronounce it. But we used to be used regularly, and sometimes was used as the only way of determining redundancies. But we don't recommend that that's used now.
Well, no. When age discrimination came in, one of the very clear warnings was that LIFO, last in, first out, was not an acceptable criteria, other than, and we do still use it, but only in the context of a tiebreak. So if all else is equal, and someone perhaps you've got 2 people, maybe 3 people have all scored the lowest score, but you only need to pick 1 from those 3, that's when you would use the last in, first out, but only in that kind of tiebreak scenario.
Okay. And we'll talk about it later, but you'll also see that furloughed is down there. And it really isn't a sensible thing to do, because there may be all sorts of reasons that people are on furlough, like they're shielding or whatever. It's not a good thing to do. You need to go about it a different way. Okay, so the pitfalls really in selection, when employment tribunals look at this, was this a good selection process, or was it not? Did they actually just look at a hit list of deadwood or young or old workers, or all their troublemakers, whistleblowers, and so on and so forth? And did they actually consult when they were using selection criteria? Did they talk to people about the selection criteria they were going to use and ask them, the ability to challenge it? If you're going to use attendance, if somebody says, well, you never keep records anyway, how can you judge any of us on attendance? Then it's something that you would probably then slip out of your selection criteria. But if you haven't consulted, you haven't given your employees, your workers, the opportunity to do that. And Peter, inform affected staff of their scores, but not necessarily those of the others. Can you just explain there what that actually means in practice?
Yeah, it's generally a good idea to explain to people what they scored. Sometimes people don't really want to know because it's a bit embarrassing, but they should be told. They'll say, well, what's everybody else got? And there you should just give them the totals that other people have scored on an anonymous basis. And the point of that is that information is personal to them, but the individual needs to know how they've done. So if the total scoring was potentially 50 and somebody's got 15, and they're the worst scorer, they need to know whether the next worst person got 17 or 25. Because if it's 17, it may be worth their while challenging, whereas if it's 25, they're probably going to struggle to convince you to give them another 10 points.
Yeah, absolutely. But if there's a pool of just 2 people,
then you probably, with the permission of the other person, going to have to share that, because you can't hide behind total anonymity, and they would potentially get it at tribunal anyway. So you've just got to make the best of the bad job, but share your intention with the other person so they don't feel that you've disclosed it without their permission.
Okay. And obviously consultation is hugely important. So what's the best time to start consulting? Well, European law, which threw a bit of a spanner in the work quite a long time ago, said as soon as redundancies are proposed, the UK law interprets this. I looked this up yesterday. As soon as there is an identifiable plan, in other words, as soon as you have agreed with management, actually, this is what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to make some redundancies. In theory, you start consulting with your workforce to say, we are in a redundancy situation and we're planning this. It's really important to avoid doing redundancies piecemeal.
Yes, what you don't want is the death of 1,000 knives or 1,000 cuts, whichever expression you would like to use, because people are then going to be constantly on edge each week, thinking, well, looking around nervously, going, I wonder who's going to go this week. So if you've got to reduce your staff, we would always strongly advise that you do it all at the same time, and then you can move on and tell the workforce, once the whole consultation process has complete, okay, we now need to move forward. Never forget the survivors as well as the victims.
Just one technical point. Supposing an organisation decides this week that they're going to make 10 redundancies, and then business falls off 6 weeks later, and they go, we've got to make another 15.
Right.
You can see where I'm coming from, can't you?
Yes, I can. In terms of your numbers, it's the number of redundancies in any 3-month period. 3-month period. Okay. So, to use your analogy, you have to add up. And at the point where you go over the magic number of 20, and you may not have anticipated at the start that that's what you're going to do, but as soon as you've realised that you've gone over 20, then you've got to start group redundancy consultation, and then you're going to have that difficult job of explaining to them why you didn't do group redundancy consultation at the beginning. So okay, so that's why it's quite important, if you know that you're likely to have to do redundancies later, better to do it all now,
yes,
rather than later and then get caught out because you've suddenly gone over 20 and you've now unexpectedly found yourself in group redundancy consultation.
But of course, there will be organisations that were very hopeful of being eased from lockdown, like airlines, and then all of a sudden find everybody's going back into quarantine again and are having to rapidly recalculate what their business is going to be like for the rest of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And the employment law does recognise that significant factors can change, but they do need to be significant, rather than you've just changed your mind and decided actually you'd like to have a few more. The whole process of senior management is you're supposed to be strategic and be looking ahead.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And there are, so you talk about looking ahead, there are also some significant milestones that may occur by the termination date. That's the important date when you're calculating things like continuous length of service. Somebody's asked a question about 2 years service, and significant ages of people, because the calculations change. When you're older than 22, after your 22nd birthday and after your 41st birthday. So the calculations for redundancy change, and you just need to bear those things in mind. Okay, Consultation must be meaningful. It is designed to avoid and reduce the number of redundancies. It's designed to mitigate the effect of the recruitment process. It is what it is designed to do. So you're looking for alternatives, you're talking to your employees about what you can actually do. And it's a two-way consultation process. And just make a note that if you are doing collective consultations and you have big company-wide or division-wide consultations with loads of people, either on a big Zoom call or in a big hall, you also absolutely have to do individual consultations with each person. So you can understand if you're making 70 people redundant and you think you may have to see some of them 2 or 3 or even 4 times, it's going to take you a long time just to get around that number of people, and it's going to be a major project management exercise. So, minimum consultation periods depends on the number of staff affected. The actual law, if you look at it, says the number of redundancies you're proposing to make, but it does then go on to add some bits to that, and it ends up as being the number of staff affected, which I'm going to ask Peter about in a moment. Key benchmarks are: is it more than 100? In which case you have to consult for at least 45 days. Is it more than 20? You have to consult for more than 30 days. They're in red because they're also classed as collective redundancies, and there are some slightly different rules about collective redundancies than anything that is 19 and under. Peter, can you just talk us through what staff affected means rather than the redundancies you're going to make?
It also includes people redeployed either into new jobs as a way of saving them, i.e. avoiding redundancies, or moved to other sites, which would be a way of saving them from redundancy. So you can't say, oh, it's only 15 people and another 15 have been saved. Well, if they've been saved by being redeployed, then they should have been included in the numbers. And also, if you are planning on changing people's contracts substantially or particularly changing their pay, which is a major change, then that, under the European definition, means that they are part of the exercise as well. So it all adds up and very quickly can get to 20 or more, or indeed 45 or more.
Yeah,
sorry, 100 or more.
100 or more
Yeah.
for the 45 days. Yeah, okay. So it's crucial you get that right and you get your calculation right on that side, because that's that can be quite costly. Now, Cathy, you and Peter do a lot of these, but can you just run through what an individual consultation will look like?
Okay, so at the start, what you're telling somebody is they are at risk of potential redundancy. Please do not tell people you're going to be redundant, because that implies there is no meaningful consultation. They are only at risk at that particular moment. Therefore, you need to confirm to them what the consultation process is going to involve and how long it will be involved for. You need to tell them, as we've previously mentioned, what the selection process will be and even the selection criteria, if that is relevant to them. Another key question is whether you're asking people to continue working during the consultation period or not. We normally would recommend don't, because particularly if you're saying that that role is going to no longer exist, but then say, but we still need you to work, it's a slight dichotomy. And also you've got a very miserable employee, and they could pull down the morale of the people around them as well, who find it very difficult and don't know what to say because this person is potentially at risk. So these are all things you need to think about. You definitely need to consider the employee's comments in terms of whether they feel they've been fairly selected or not. And they may have other comments like, well, you know, if we did this proposal, this would save X amount of money, which would therefore save my job. So therefore, you do need to consider what they may raise as alternatives. it isn't just that employees ask how much they're going to get by way of redundancy. Some employees will fight very hard, and they will do, particularly at the moment, because they know that there's so few jobs out there. And obviously, a common question is also going to be, why can't I stay on furlough? So you've got to prepare and have the answers ready, and anticipate what sort of answers you're going to get during that consultation process. And it is only at the end of that individual consultation that you would then issue a letter advising somebody that you are now confirming that they are at risk. Because there are so many variables in a consultation process, please do not make the mistake of giving guarantees to others, or that little nod and wink, don't worry, you'll be okay, that they are safe, because there are issues, for instance, of appeals, more of that later. There's this concept of bumping, more of that later, which could mean that someone that was originally at risk is then not at risk, and someone that wasn't at risk now is. So, and the first thing they'll say is, but you told me confidentially I was safe. So please don't give guarantees until the process is complete.
Okay, thank you. So one of the legal obligations you have when you are making people redundant is obviously to listen to them and consult properly, but obviously to consider if there is alternative employment within the organisation. You may well have some vacancies that they may well be able to apply for, and to be able to do. Failure to consider alternative work, and some employers just go, no, there is nothing else available, end of story, could mean that the dismissal is unfair. And just because it needs a little bit of training doesn't necessarily make it unsuitable work that you shouldn't consider. And Peter, I think we talked about this earlier, but statutory, you and I talked about it, statutory trial period of 4 weeks. So if they try alternative work, it might be a completely different job. They're allowed to try it for 4 weeks, yeah?
Yeah, and it is a two-way trial. It's mostly about whether the employee thinks, yes, I could do this job, or I would want to do this job. And it can be extended, particularly if there is a training requirement. So often I've extended ostensibly on the grounds of training, just to give both parties a bit longer, and to give both parties the right to say, actually not working, redundancy pay, etc. still applies.
Okay, so you then go back to the redundancy situation. Yeah. And of course, it's important to point out there are two things. Cathy mentioned it briefly earlier, but you've got no obligation to create vacancies to make alternative employment, but you've also got no obligation to put employees onto furlough. And this is one of the questions we're getting a lot at the moment is, why are you making redundant when you can put me on furlough? Well, there is no obligation to put somebody on furlough, which the government is presumably fairly relieved about because it's costing them a lot of money. There is no obligation to put people on furlough. It is just one of a number of alternative things an employer can choose to do. When we were putting together this, we tried to define what is suitable employment, and we decided actually it was rather better to define what was unsuitable, because it's much more easily defined. Unsuitable work. So if you offer people work that's going to involve them in a loss of pay, a loss of status, or it's going to affect their contractual terms substantially, then that can certainly be deemed by the employee to be unsuitable. Likewise, changing of hours or moving into in an inappropriate location. But one of the biggest traps that employers make, I think, Cathy, you were saying this, is that they make assumptions that, oh, we won't be interested in that. Oh, she'll never do that.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, so the reality is, always tell people about other vacancies that exist, and then go through them with the employee. And you might both agree that quite a few of those roles are not suitable, but don't make an assumption that an employee wouldn't take a job with loss of status and loss of pay, because at the moment, I think a lot of people will be working on the principle better to be in a job than to be out of work. So also check out people's personal circumstances, because, for instance, you might be offering them a job which you think is suitable, but they will say is unsuitable because they can't then, for instance, pick up their children from school, which they previously did, or it might be a single dad who goes and drives quite a distance every other weekend to go and collect his children for the weekend, and he can't then do that. So you need to understand people's circumstances as to why they might have very good reason to say, actually, these changes are unsuitable.
Yeah, okay. And although we say unreasonable refusal by the employee may lose their right to redundancy payment, I think, Peter was saying earlier on that actually that happens very, very rarely. But and generally the courts look at what the employee considers to be suitable rather than necessarily what the employer views as suitable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Peter, bumping and transferred redundancies, very controversial.
Yeah, but bumping tends to rear its ugly head during recessions because people are desperate to hang on to a job, so they'll drop down or they'll say, I can move across and do someone else's job who's totally unaffected by it, and that person can be made redundant. The alternative term is displaced redundancies. Legally, it is perfectly acceptable. Ethically and morally, it's pretty debatable. But your obligation is to consider it, not necessarily to do it, but just to consider it and give those reasonable reasons for why you're not going to do it.
Okay. And it's one of the reasons why Cathy underlined earlier on that no one is safe until the consultation process is complete, because in theory, at a higher level can ask to be bumped down to a lower level. It might make perfect sense for the organisation, in which case the poor bloke who's doing a very good job somewhere else is out of a job.
Yeah, that's the way it works.
That's the way it works. Now, collective consultations. When you're making, or when 20 or more employees are affected by the redundancy process, there is a statutory part of the statutory process is that you have to appoint representatives. We talked about that, and there's a very well-defined process that has to be followed, appointing representatives. And Cathy, we're going to talk about that, I think, in the next slide, all about transparency and so on and so forth. So I'll park this here for the moment, other than to say representatives need to be there. You may well already have a trade union. If you haven't got a trade union, then you've got to get representatives elected from those who are at risk. Consultations must take place in good time. So although the minimum period is 30 or 45 days, don't say, we've announced the redundancies and we'll consult with you on day 43, so you can all be on your way by day 45. Consultation must take place within those 45 days in good time. So this is the pitfalls, especially for collective redundancies. There's a thing called an HR1 form that has to be sent off to the government that tells them that you're going to be making them. And in theory, it has to be before you make any redundancy announcements. But Peter was pointing out to us that you don't want to do it a long time before, because there can be leaks. Trade union officials particularly are quite well connected with these departments and find out about these things before the workforce do. So don't do it lots of time before. And in fact, Cathy, I think you've often recommended, in the old days, you used to fax it off just before you made the redundancy announcement.
Yes, and these days I would imagine it's electronically, but the reality is, yeah, I would normally do it literally 30 minutes before you make the actual announcement.
Yeah. And there's an obligation, obviously, make sure you are going to do collective things, but you can't just all get them into a room and say, you and you are going to be, anybody got any objections? You've got to consult individually as well. And the other thing is the lack of transparency. Cathy, do you want to just run through that, because it's all about a lot of it's about representatives and proper meetings.
Right. Okay. So some organisations may well already have shop stewards because they recognise unions. You may have a works council, or you may have, for instance, a staff representative group. In that case, you've already got reps in place. But the reality is most organisations don't. So the first thing you have to do under group redundancy consultation is to appoint reps. Now, they have to be elected. As you said, it's not management saying you're going to be the reps. So you basically have to decide, as part of your planning process right at the beginning, how many reps will you need for each of the affected sections. So if you only have a small section of, say, 5 people, you may only need 1 rep from that affected area. But you may have a much bigger section where, for instance, say you have 40 people that potentially could be affected, then you may wish to appoint 2 or 3 reps from that particular area. So you need to know your numbers in advance, so that when you put people into different rooms and go, right, we need 3 reps, no one leaves this room until we've got 3 reps. Have we got any volunteers, or would anybody like to nominate someone else? And you basically get it that way, so that you have your nominated reps. Then you've got to tell your reps what their role is. So sit down with them, maybe give them an hour's briefing session, give them some notes as to what they can do as representatives, so that they fully understand that they need to talk to the people in their area, find out what the questions are that need to be raised, how are they going to feed that back to them. Make sure that you give them the time to do this, because if they're still working, they will need time to do this representative role. And then above all else, make sure that when you have your group consultation meetings, you've got someone taking notes, because they're raising lots of questions, you're providing answers. You want a written record of that, because then you can give that to the reps to give out to other people, and then you don't get Chinese whispers. So minutes of the group consultation meeting is very important.
Okay. And one of the other pitfalls, it may seem fairly obvious, but don't give any notice of dismissals out before you've completed your consultation. Otherwise, your consultation will not be seen as being a meaningful consultation.
Correct.
Okay, and why is this important? Well, certainly within collective redundancies, there's a thing called a protective award. I'll briefly run through this with you, but it can be up to 90 days pay if the employment tribunal decides you have not followed the proper procedure. It can be for each employee who is affected by the redundancy. And I think, Cathy, you said was involved in the consultation. So it can be anybody who was in the selected pools, indeed.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it isn't necessarily the people that were made redundant. If you fail to properly consult with everyone, then if everyone has put in the claim for a protective award, then they would get it.
And if there were 60 people in that selected pool and they were earning an average of £30,000 a year, make no mistake, it's a massive amount of money. I think it's about £450,000 the protected award would be. It's huge. Yeah. Because it is based on actual pay, there is no statutory limit. So whatever people are paid, they get 90 days or about a quarter of a year's money.
Yeah.
If the employment tribunal gives the maximum award. It's a lot of money.
And the tribunals are encouraged to start with 90 days and then listen to arguments why it should be less, rather than work up towards.
Okay. So financial penalties, unfair dismissal, I think you mostly know about, but it can be very, very expensive. Right, statutory redundancy. I have been asked, in fact, we haven't had many questions come in, and I can't believe that there are no questions. I can't believe we've been that clear, but if we have, I'm delighted. But we have been asked whether somebody is risk of redundancy if they have less than 2 years service. Is the same process followed, and we'll cover that in the questions later. But statutory redundancy specifically covers employees with service of 2 years or more. It is a complicated calculation. This is how the calculation is based, but our advice is to use, there is a redundancy calculator on the government website that is well worth using, because it takes you through it completely. But essentially, for each full year of service between these ages, you get this entitlement up to a maximum of your last 20 years with the company or the organisation. So if somebody is aged 45, let's say, that means they've got 3 years service at 1.5 weeks, and then the rest of the year's service at 1 week. So it's about 22.5 weeks. So it's a complicated calculation. Use the calculator, but weekly pay is capped at £538 at the moment, which means that the maximum statutory redundancy you could possibly get is just over £16,000. But don't forget, there is also the taxable parts of pay you have to pay, which is for notice and accrued holiday, that have to be paid on top of that. Any redundancy pay, not taxable pay, but redundancy pay under £30,000 is not taxable. Anything over that is. We talked a little bit about redundancy policy earlier, Peter, and perhaps you can briefly just talk through what actually having a contractual redundancy policy of some sort means.
Hopefully, it just talks about process. In short, in brief terms, which is what our clients mostly have. I don't think, well, certainly none of my clients, and I don't think any of Cathy's clients actually say how much redundancy pay that they will pay out. And there's a good reason, two good reasons for that. One is most of our clients aren't that generous or rich. And secondly, if you say that, it potentially lets the HMRC get at it. So if you're going to be more generous, do it, I'm not going to say randomly, but do it differently on each occasion so that it doesn't look like custom and practice that everybody would say, oh, of course everybody gets 1.5 times statutory. It's what we've done every other year for the last 20. Yeah. If you do that redundancy that regularly.
Okay. So sometimes do it at statutory, sometimes do it more generously, sometimes do it
or differently generously.
Okay, and again, redundancy settlements, under £30,000, redundancy pay at least under £30,000 is not taxable. But redundancy consultation on furlough is tricky at times because people are at home and perhaps saying they can't make that meeting or their broadband's down or whatever. Face-to-face on site is clearly the best solution, but with social distancing and people's nervousness, it may not be the thing that they'll all stick their hands up for unless they're already in the workplace. Video conferencing is probably the next best thing. By phone or email is a real last resort. Phone's clearly better than email. It's better than SMS. Make sure that your selection criteria is not that one of them is not that they're currently furloughed, because that can be discriminatory for a whole variety of reasons. And if you confirm meeting arrangements, minutes in writing by email or by post, if they say they're not getting their email, then you'll cover all of the bases. But the important headline here is just allow more time. Right, Cathy. There is no legal right to appeal against a redundancy dismissal, but there's a big but there.
Yes, in law, strangely enough, if you're saying that it's a fair dismissal, redundancy is a fair dismissal, there is no appeal process. However, ACAS recommend it, and we certainly do. And we go further. We actually say that they can appeal twice. The first is whilst they're still in employment, that they can appeal against their selection, because they may say that the scoring was wrong, the two scorers used were totally biased, and they can prove that the bias of those individuals. All sorts of things can be raised as part of the appeal against selection. And then once they've been dismissed, they have a further appeal against the fact they've actually been dismissed on grounds of redundancy. And again, they might choose to challenge the whole of the consultation process. They could perhaps argue was not fair. During appeals, obviously, they have the right to be accompanied. It's up to you in terms of how you've defined it. But the right of accompaniment is a work colleague or accredited trade union representative. Now, we use the word may be accompanied because actually legally they don't have the right. And actually, it's a common myth that people think that they have the right to be accompanied throughout all redundancy consultation meetings, and that isn't the case. Albeit ACAS suggests that it might be a good idea, the reality is legally they don't have that right. And the final point is making sure that appeal meetings are held by an independent person, in other words, someone that wasn't directly involved in the redundancy and particularly the selection process. That can be a bit challenging if you're a very small organisation with a very small management structure, which is why it's important as part of your planning process that you think right back at the beginning, well, who are we going to hold back for appeals, and therefore make sure that they're not involved actively in the redundancy process, or certainly for those groups of individuals. So appeals are important. We would certainly recommend them.
Okay, thank you. Great. Now we've only really got 2 substantive slides less. I know we're getting near our hour. We did say it was going to be about an hour, this training, but settlement agreements, if you're only making a few redundancies or maybe just one that you need to make, settlement agreements are a very effective alternative. There's things that we get involved a lot in. They're very clean and quick. And Peter, perhaps you just very quickly talk about why settlement agreements give good protection to the organisation.
Because if they're done properly, and if that mean, and that will mean that they are signed off by a solicitor, and don't be worried by that. Most of them will just rubber stamp or just spot your typos or whatever. They provide that legal finality. They may also, providing you've not misled people, give you the opportunity to reappoint later, or sooner rather than later. And they're also, in a sense, less hassle for the employer. They're not a DIY activity. A number of our clients have asked us to do that over the years, and we take away all the pain. We'll still be involved in, can we do this? Or they say they've got more holiday, those sort of detailed discussions, or can you help draft a reference? But they're a neat solution, especially if you want to enhance the package because you're feeling generous, stroke guilty, and you don't want them coming back having thought you've been generous and they've left happily, and they make a tribunal claim afterwards. So that they provide that certainty that, to be honest, is beneficial to both parties.
Yeah.
Can I just also add, in a redundancy scenario where settlement agreements are so important, are that you don't actually have to put other people at risk. If you've got a group of people and you know that there's one person that you want, rather than having to put everyone at risk of redundancy and with all of the uncertainty and insecurity that can cause, just by doing a settlement agreement for that one individual and sorting them out means that everybody else isn't affected.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to talk briefly about outplacement, because if you make people redundant, it's very important to think about your survivors within the organisation. Now, outplacement's got nothing to do with survivors, you might think, but actually it tells you how you treat people going forward. And outplacement is something we're doing more and more of. I know my guys, it's a completely separate division, have been doing loads of CVs for people this week, and employers can just buy a voucher that entitles their employee to a half-price CV writing service if they want to, or they can go into a full 3-week course, which is online with lots of interaction. But what it does is it gives you better protection as an employer because in theory, the right outplacement will do two things. It may just immediately help somebody to get into a job quicker, or it may reorientate them to think, actually, there are new and emerging technologies out there, new and emerging industries, and I might try and go and get myself over there rather than do what I have always done. You will get, obviously, it says there will be disputes there. I think we meant there will be less disputes. In other words, the quicker you get people into the work, the much less likely they are, especially with 2 years waiting lists as they're talking about now for employment tribunals, the much less likely they are about trying to take you to an employment tribunal. An outplacement, compared to settling a case for somebody who feels they've been wrongfully dismissed, is not expensive. As I say, it can be as little as about £75 for a half-price CV service, which the employee contributes towards as well, right the way through to a 3-week course. So it's something that we're viewing as very important, and I know we offer it as part of settlement agreements where it is appropriate, as well as on the redundancy side. So, Cathy, we've come to the end of our hour. In fact, as we did in our run through, we've just run slightly over, but now is the time to sum up. Perhaps you could just take us through some of the key points we've covered, and then we'll answer some of the questions that are beginning to come in.
Right. So redundancy is a technical and complex HR process which has to be properly managed. Therefore, you must spend time planning it. As Peter says, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So the first thing we do with our clients is to spend time doing that planning process. It's thinking through the selection processes that will be involved for the various different groups of workers. What will be involved in terms of the consultation process, the number of meetings, the types of letters they're going to need. Timetabling those activities and, importantly, dates, checking that the people are available. So key managers are involved, then they're available to actually do this. It is absolutely about good communication. And first of all, please don't forget your poor managers that you are expecting to do redundancies. They may never have done this before. So brief them on what to do and say, and probably more importantly, what not to say. Communicate with the affected people and indeed their representatives. Talk to them, answer their questions, try and be as transparent as possible. And please don't forget all the other people, which we've called the survivors. They're not affected, but they're watching very closely how other people are being treated. But equally, don't give them the message, you're safe, until you know that the whole of the consultation process has been done. You must have a good audit trail, and the only way you can do that is by providing detailed documentation, which would include, for instance, a series of letters to those involved, notes of meetings. That's particularly apparent for individual consultation. If you're into group redundancy consultation, you would want to give out not only the main announcement, do loads of frequently asked questions, you would want to give out copies of the notes of all of the group consultation meetings. So there is, and the timetable. So there is a lot of documentation, not only to be prepared, but then actually done throughout the whole of the process. And always be ready for the unexpected. Because things like appeals and bumping, you don't know whether they will crop up or not. So make sure you give yourself enough time so that you can do some contingency work. If you give yourself too short a timetable, then the reality is you'll do it in a too hurried a way, and you may find yourself up at tribunal. So it's all about preparation.
Okay. And there was one important thing that Jackie actually pointed out to us a little bit earlier, is that employment tribunals are increasingly looking, because they're getting much more tech savvy, at properties on documents. So if you're thinking of typing up a letter in summary of a meeting for somebody, do not, for goodness sake, type it up before the meeting takes place and then send it off to the employee afterwards. Start typing it, start creating things afterwards. because that is what will happen if it's a proper consultation. If it's not a proper consultation, you have all the letters prepared and you just hand them out afterwards, and it's so do it in the right order. I think a lot of the message here is if you do things in the right order, it looks much better than if you do them in the wrong order. Many thanks for listening. I hope that you found this webinar useful. Redundancy is a tough, difficult process. It's tough for organisations and it's tough for the employees who are affected. Make sure that you do everything right and follow the correct process. Please treat this presentation as advice and not as detailed legal advice. If you are unsure about anything, then make sure that you speak to the professionals before you act. Our phone lines are always open. Pick up the phone and we will see what we can do to help. And we'll let you know what might need to happen if there's something more involved. But I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Good luck with everything, and hope we will see you online again soon.